the narrative is told diegetically as the player navigates the platform. And by that, I mean, you sort of explore files, emails, instant messages, videos. There's not necessarily external dialogue or description, but it's also important to emphasize that the narratives in these games also in some way involve the platform itself. And sometimes this is foregrounded pretty heavily, other times it's less obvious, but in most cases, these games will engage with the affordances, the limitations, and the ideology of the platform in some way. And we're going to dig into this in a few slides' time. But examples of games that do this sort of work include Hypnospace Outlaw. That's probably the most famous and most recent example of that. But a favorite of Catherine and mine is Christine Love's Digital: A Love Story. Hypnospace Outlaw is sort of
GeoCities.
Yeah, GeoCities Internet, and Digital is sort of BBS culture as well. Some other games. Telling Lies by Sam Barlow and company, and Cosmosurf by Judith Pinter, who you probably have seen running around the conference as well. She's a conference member.
Yeah.
And I wanted to put these two side to side just to sort of illustrate the gap in timelines. People have been writing these sorts of games for a very long time. So Cosmosurf was released in 1992. I believe it was the winner of the Adventure Game Toolkit competition at that time. And then, Telling Lies is 2019 as well.
Yeah, and one thing that we're going to get farther into as we go along is that you may have noticed that some of these games, the technology that they're emulating is of the time, and others are simulating older tech, and we'll get more into that later.
Yeah, on that line, we have wiki-likes as well. So Neurocracy is a game from 2020 where you sort of dig into a futuristic Wikipedia-esque interface as well. Excalibur by JJ Guest and Grim Bakaris, who just gave a lovely talk, and Josh Grams as well. It sort of simulates like a fandom website, like a wiki fandom.
Yeah, for a sci-fi franchise.
Yeah, exactly. So for lack of a better term, we were going to call this Twitterture, and then we decided that that's
We're not ever going to call it that again.
I also suggested platformers, but that one was taken. So
yes.
Interface fiction, we can sort of call it this for the rest of the presentation. And actually, a disclaimer, we came up with the idea for interface fiction after we submitted
the description.
The description for the talk. Yeah, so it's way catchier than Immersive.
Yes, we've iterated on our name, so.
Yeah, so forgive us, but that's what we're going to call it from now on. Even though we just sort of have given this style of game a name, we do sort of have a disclaimer, and that is that this sort of game is necessarily broad, and we're going to be talking about a lot of different games in this presentation. We've already talked about a lot of different games that do different things. Not every game is going to fit perfectly into sort of a neat little interface fiction package. But I think that that's okay. Our intention here is not to like demarcate what sort of games fit into certain boxes and stuff like that. I don't think that that's a particularly like fruitful or interesting exercise. And I'm taking this from Stacey Mason and her PhD dissertation, Responsiveness in Narrative Systems. She says that games should be viewed through lenses and not put into boxes. And that's what we're trying to do here. Is we're trying to provide sort of a lens through which to view this style of game.
Yeah, and we kind of touched on this, but we just want to reiterate that we're not going to come near mentioning every game along these lines. There are just too many, and they go back to way too long for us to even come close. We are going to have like a further reading section at the end for some things that we find interesting but couldn't get to, but even those are nowhere near the scope of it.
Mm-hmm. And if you have examples of things that we haven't touched on or like aren't aware of,
please
do want
let
to hear
us know.
About them. Yeah, because as Justin mentioned at the beginning, we are writing a game about 90s shareware at the moment, and we're sickos for this sort of thing.
Basically, yes.
So why are these games interesting, or why these games are interesting, either or?
Yeah, so I'll just take the first part, which is the obvious, that there is a huge amount of nostalgia among audiences for the technologies that they grew up with and or recognize. This is especially perhaps the case for older technologies, because as quickly as corporations are to discard certain programs or platforms, which is something we'll get into later, while there are users who are early adopters and will do the same, not everybody is like that, which is probably good for the world. And people develop attachments to the platforms that they use during their formative years. There's spaces that they grew up in, where they met people, where things happened in their lives, and they really become settings more than they become technology after a certain point, and after a certain amount of memories have been attached to them. And of course, the space you're in is trying to capture some of that as well. And it's worth mentioning also that nostalgia was essentially how the scene kind of worked for a while, because for a couple decades in the 90s and 2000s, the whole best known interactive fiction creators were more or less reclaiming in a hobbyist way various commercial properties, whether it be the free parser games that emulated Infocom's products of the 80s, or further along the Twine games, the choose your own adventure likes that emulated, again, the commercial franchise choose your own adventure that was very specific about that being a commercial name in the 80s. And of course, these days it's less of a hobbyist only like venture, and how much of that back then was by choice and how much people would have wanted to commercialize the work depends on the person. But the fact that even without that external incentive, these came about just demonstrates how strong this force is. And just as an aside, such a thing also exists as quote unquote fantasy consoles, which are emulated recreations of old platforms sometimes, but not necessarily with the story. Sometimes they're tools, sometimes they're just, hey, just hang out in this Windows 3.1 for a bit. And sometimes there are frames for like compilations, like Zachtronics just released Last Call BBS, which is something like that. And so people will just enjoy this without even a story. And sometimes there can even be a subversive element of just taking these discarded technologies, stripping them of whatever .com soullessness they once had, and extracting the human element that was always there at the end user level. And if all of this sounds very optimistic, don't worry, we will soon be raining on this parade.
Yeah. But don't you worry, yeah, we will.
But while we're still on the optimism, there's the other aspect, which a couple of people have touched upon on their talks as well, which is that when you're using or emulating a platform, you have built-in tutorializing in a sense. People know how to use these platforms. They use them every day. Depending on what the state of their life is, they may have spent a majority of the hours of their existence learning and using them.
They may still be using them.
Yes.
You know?
And this muscle memory has just been trained into them through years of use. And as anybody who's designed games to a broad audience knows, that kind of familiarity of automatically knowing what you're supposed to do with this interface is not guaranteed, and it's not sometimes easy to create. So you kind of have a head start in the sense. And of course, as mentioned before, older interactive fiction took advantage of this kind of muscle memory from the start, since classic parsers, text adventure parsers, would mimic the feeling of typing into a Unix or DOS command prompt, which of course later on became unintuitive, but at the time was a bit closer to how people were doing things with the computer just as a course of using it. And then Twine was based on hyperlink-based wiki software like TiddlyWiki. So that was very much part of the thinking from early on.
Yeah. And to sort of introduce our final point regarding why these games are and can be so compelling, I'm going to do something extraordinarily cheesy and embarrassing and recite a quote that you have almost certainly seen before on the internet. Whatever you now find weird, ugly, uncomfortable, and nasty about a new medium will surely become its signature. CD distortion, the jitteriness of digital video, the crap sound of 8-bit, all of these will be cherished and emulated as soon as they can be avoided. It's the sound of failure. So much modern art is the sound of things going out of control, of a medium pushing to its limits and breaking apart. And that was by Brian Eno, who said that. So yeah, I mean, this quote is a bit cheesy, but it does explain pretty nicely why these games can be so compelling, rather, for a couple of reasons. And I think the biggest one here is that the space between the adoption of a platform and its obsolescence is full of interesting narrative points that you can sort of play with. And if we consider Enos Quote, which I will go back to here, through the lens of computer software, I really want to sort of highlight the now here in this quote. I think that there's it works slightly differently with computer software. And the reason why is because what you find weird, ugly, uncomfortable, and nasty is or was once cutting edge technology or design. And users would only consider something weird or ugly or uncomfortable once something newer and better and faster and clearer sort of emerges to replace it. So it's not necessarily what can be avoided, but rather what comes along to replace it. And we see this cycle of, adoption and obsolescence much more frequently in computer software and the computer industry than with other mediums, like especially like CD distortion and digital video. CDs existed for decades, and then replaced vinyl records, which existed for decades. And I think if you want to get really granular about it, 8-tracks were in there at some point. But yeah, there's this sort of explains why this style of game has existed for decades, despite vastly different technologies and interfaces and aesthetics. So if I'm going to scroll all the way back here, you've got CosmoServe, which simulates a BBS, and the screenshot here is a DOS environment. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's a DOS shell command. And then you have sort of a modern laptop interface, and you're viewing videos and stuff like that. So very different interfaces, but doing similar work. And I had mentioned, as I awkwardly scroll all the way back to where I want to be, I had mentioned earlier that interface fiction narratives sort of often involve the affordances and the limitations and the ideologies of the platforms that they simulate. And I think that Brian Eno quote is a really compelling illustration of the questions that we also take for granted when we consider the use cycle of platforms. So to reiterate what Catherine said earlier, platforms aren't necessarily just technologies, they're also spaces. There are places where users invested their time and their energy to communicate, to play, and in many cases also just to function. The thing that is sort of missed in the optimism of the Brian Eno quote is that a vast majority of these platforms, and not all of them, I don't want to paint with a super wide brush, but a vast majority of these platforms were and are designed by companies for profit. And profit-motivated design decisions will emerge if you are using a platform or an interface to tell a game, or to tell a story, or to play a game.
And those profit judgments too.
Yeah, exactly. And those decisions will prompt questions. For instance, what demographic does that platform target? What demographic uses it? Is there a socioeconomic, generational, or gendered component to the users who used and later cherished, to use Enos' term, these platforms and interfaces? If the platform now elicits a nostalgic reaction, what replaced the platform and why? How were these platforms originally designed? How, as the platform aged or matured, how did that intended use change over time? Are users sort of using it in a different way than the designers intended? And then also, how many of these questions are motivated by or resistant to like capitalist greed or profit or excessive growth?
Yeah. Sorry to butt in. And one more thing that I wanted to add to this is how has the socioeconomic, generational, et cetera, makeup of the platform's user base changed over time? Dana Boyd has a lot of writing along these lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And like, this is, I do not intend to throw shade on this, but like even consider the Gather platform that we're here on today. You can sort of think about who is this platform designed for? What are the limitations? What was the motivation for designing it? All of these are going to come into play, and they're all really interesting questions when you are writing this sort of story. Mm. So one good example that I just want to touch on really quickly is an IFComp entry in 2020 by Nell Raban. It's Mother Tongue. It takes place entirely within a chat interface with your mom, who regrets not teaching you Tagalog earlier in your life and attempts to do so through text and instant messaging. You can notice even in this screenshot that there's sort of generational differences in speech between the younger player character and the mom character. And it really sort of subtly and cleverly illustrates how certain platforms can funnel users into patterns of speech, often, on like Anglo-centric lines, but also here, as you can see, like on generational lines as well. Doesn't necessarily reflect one's ancestry or heritage. So this is a really sweet game that I do recommend. And if you're also interested in the, I'm doing this on the fly, I do not have this written down, but there's an excellent book on speech patterns and linguistics on the internet, and it is literally called Because Internet, and it is by Gretchen, and I cannot remember her last name. So somebody please fill it in on the chat, because I should have done my homework a little bit.
Google this really quick.
Oh yeah.
While you go to the next slide. Gretchen McCulloch.
McCulloch, that's right. I think she's at McGill. So anyway.
Yeah. So as we mentioned, there are pitfalls to this kind of thing. And the first pitfall is kind of inextricably bound into the part about nostalgia we just went into, and the limitations of it, and kind of the various people who may or may not experience it. The problem is that there are kind of too much of a good thing, in that there are lots of people who will reward this, and they'll reward it no matter what quality might be there. It's really easy to fall into a trap here of substituting this kind of nostalgia for substance, or for using it to disguise fundamental flaws in your game, in hopes that people will just be like, oh wow, this looks like Windows 95. I remember Windows 95.
Or AOL Instant Messenger.
Or AOL Instant Messenger, that kind of thing. And the second problem, kind of related, because usually you can't really do this if you're not leaning on nostalgia, or you can, it really depends, is that one thing that can happen is that you can sanitize your experience, because in the nostalgia for quote unquote the old internet is a lot of trolling, flame wars, both terms that date back to the old internet, harassment and general unpleasantness that were there, and very much the case, and very much gating off who did and did not use it, which is of course rampant today. And so if you're doing a game that replicates one of these platforms, you have two options, neither of which are great: to just sanitize it and pretend that these unsavory elements don't exist, which a lot of people do, and it's easy to see why, or to somehow try to manage to cover it in a tasteful and or fun way, which is not something that might be easy or in some cases possible. And again, related to that is the fact that any one of these games in some way is an endorsement, in the sense that it's hard to be truly scathing about a platform that you're implicitly saying is interesting and is mechanically worthwhile and is something that there should be more of. And it's very easy to, intentionally or not, find yourself in the position of cheerleading for platforms that might not be worth cheerleading for, or digging up depending on how recent they are, or if they're still running, to serve as new, or for free or at least underpriced advertising for them, which are just things that really need to be thought about if you want to do something beyond just the nostalgia exercise, I think. So now that we've said that you should think about this kind of thing, we're going to transition into how you might think about this kind of thing. And again, this is a growing field. We're not going to solve this problem in the remaining, let me see what we have remaining, 40 minutes or so. So this is a broad overview. So as I mentioned, there are as many ways to create these games as there are platforms existing or imaginable. But in general, they fall into three categories, each of which have their own unique sets of pros and cons. So the first category we have are stories that are told via already existing platforms. And on this slide, we have presented three examples, only three because, as you can see, the slide is very crowded, but there are many more. We will get into those. On the top left here, you see Mark Marino's Flight of the Code Monkeys, which is an IF-Conf entry from 2019. And it may be a bit hard to see at the resolution we have, but it's a game done entirely in a Google Colab interface, and you interact with the game through coding, basically. And this was something that I hadn't seen before when it was in the comp, and I found it quite fascinating. Bottom left is Bluefold by Aaron Reed. Oh, yes, in the chat, we will provide links to all of these after our talk. So bottom left, we have Bluefold by Aaron Reed, which is a companion piece to his piece Blue Lacuna from the 2000s, which possibly might be better known these days. But as you can see from this slide, this screenshot here, the idea of it is that it was spread among dozens of different websites. I mean, this is one screenshot of many exactly like this. And bits and pieces of the story were just spooled out among these websites. And the idea would be something similar to an ARG, or alternate reality game, which we will get into in just a minute. And then on the right is something that you may or may not have seen before, depending on how closely you follow music and or stands, but it's an example of what's was known as situation threads, which are Twitter threads that create essentially live choose your own adventure games, which interact with Twitter polls in this case. And as you can see from the example, this one happens to be by now extremely well-known rapper Lil Nas X, who was once a Twitter Nicki Minaj stan who produced a lot of viral threads like this.
Yeah, Mark and Aaron, if you're in the audience, this might be the first and perhaps only time that your names will be mentioned in the same category as Lil Nas X. So soak it in.
Yeah. And so as we mentioned, there are a couple of less narrative game genres these are closely related to, like game mods or ROM hacks that alter existing games, or as mentioned, ARGs. And Ian wants to talk about one of his favorite games at this point.
Oh, it's one of my biggest obsessions because I, as a young lad in 2001 with no credit card and a well-worn copy of PC Gamer magazine, I was obsessed with the idea of this game, which is a very early example of an ARG. It was a very ambitious project where you would download a copy of this game. Later, they gave it a retail release because it was doing very poorly. And I know that there's a retail release because I just bought a copy on eBay a few days ago for too much money. But this is a game that can no longer be played because the basic concept was that you would sort of wait around by your phone or your fax machine, and the game would call you and email you and fax you, and they would send you instant messages. So if you can see here at the bottom corner, I would get my laser pointer here, you would install this thing called the Majestic navigation system, which was sort of a client that would help players keep track of their status in the game. It contained a built-in messaging system, so you could message your friends, but you could also message fictional characters within the game as well. And you would just play the game by waiting for emails and fax messages and phone calls, which were sort of doled out neatly for pacing purposes. The game ran for about 8 months before being completely shuttered in it's a nice case of life imitating art. We were talking about the limitations of platforms, and you can no longer play this game, and yet I spent a significant amount of money to own a copy of it. So that's the lesson here is don't be like me and do this.
Or don't be like me, because I would do the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what he just mentioned about the limitations of platforms existing is one of the main pitfalls of using these existing platforms, which is that with simulated platforms, you have control over your environment. If you have a story, then you can, to some extent, bend the platform to the will of your storytelling. And with pre-existing platforms, you can't use that because you don't own them, and you're subject to the whims of whoever owns them. And if the company that owns them decides that they want to pull support for it, perhaps without notice, then that's a risk. And it even applies to the examples we presented. Blueful is separately archived on Aaron Reed's website because, as you might gather, some of these websites either no longer exist or no longer exist in the form that is in the screenshot. And then this Lil Nas X thread was temporarily unfindable when his account was suspended, and when he became more well-known, that was dug up because stands will dig up a lot of things. But it's ephemeral by nature, and as such, it's sometimes suited to more experimental pieces or just experiments, which I really like, but is something to keep in mind. The second category is something that we're just going to touch on briefly because it's so broad, which are partially diegetic games that just happen to have a computer interface someplace in there as a major narrative component. And these are much more flexible since you can somehow justify having a computer in most narratives because that's just something that's ever present. However, they can come off as really cheap or gimmicky if they're done poorly. Like, they're kind of a cliche since there are so many of them depending on what you're doing. And conversely, if these interface elements are too compelling, then they can overshadow the rest of it, and people will just get sidetracked on this computer that they can play around with at the expense of everything else they've done.
Yeah, and the important thing to remember too with this is that, like, if we really want to get sticky and pedantic about it, 99% of games have a partially diegetic component to them. Maybe not 99%. That's high. But I mean, yeah, a lot of them. I mean, you can consider something like, you know, if you're hacking a computer terminal in Deus Ex, or I thought of an example this morning, the codec from like the Metal Gear series. You could consider that like a partially diegetic interface. But for our purposes here, we're interested in interfaces that are a little bit more navigable and mechanically comprehensive than something that might just serve as like a, you know, push a few buttons to unlock a door, or like an info dump or something like that. You know, you want to be able to feel it and to move through it.
Yeah, which is unsurprisingly our final category here, which is fully diegetic games that are simulations of existing platforms. The entire game, sorry if you can hear that, I live in New York. The entire game takes place on whatever simulated platform you use, but you create that yourself. Sometimes they might present themselves as a literal computer screen that you have like the reflections of light on, as here. Sometimes, especially with browser games, they might mimic an enterprise website, and in some cases even let on as little as possible that they are in fact games and not just things that exist in the internet. And these, of course, offer the most complete and immersive experience and have huge potential rewards. But they're also the highest stakes. You're banking on this interface to carry the whole thing by itself. You're banking on it to be accurate enough so people won't be like, excuse me, it wasn't like this. We'll get to that later. You're banking on accuracy, anachronism, functionality, smoothness, excuse me. And it's by far the most code and design intensive. It's not really something you can do with a default template or, depending on what they are, generic assets. For this reason, a lot of commercial games are like this, or rather, a lot of these are made by commercial teams rather than lone developers, just because it's a lot heavier of a lift.
Except for Sam, because he's, you know, he's a wizard and he can do it himself.
Yes, so some people. Yeah, there are exceptions. Oh my god, the Muppet CD-ROM, amazing. Yes. Yeah. So, right. As much as I would love to talk about that, we do only have 60 minutes. So we're going to get to the next major aspect, which is scope. Because no matter what interface you choose, it most likely has so many features, so many functionality, often built up over decades. Just if it's a personal computer, you have games, as you can see on the slide, applications, files upon files, not all of which tell any kind of story, or in our configuration files or log files or whatever clogs up your computer. And if it's a website, then they have as many features as developers decided to leave in because the technical debt just said they had to. Mm-hmm. And if they're, like we mentioned, settings, then they're entire worlds that were built up over years, often by millions of users. They're optimized to suck you in by nature. That's why they exist. They want you on there as long as possible. And so they also have no set endpoint. They're as limitless as the caverns of data storage that support them and the people who will put things on there.
Yeah, so this is a problem for you when you're designing a game like this. You know, on the one hand, the more closely that you emulate your interface as fully as you possibly can, the more content you add to your world, the more immersive it will be, and if done well, the more compelling it will feel. Emily Short, once wrote a blog post that was originally sort of designed or targeted rather towards parser games, but it is applicable here, and it was just called Make It Juicy, make games that feel alive and respond to everything that you do, or everything that the player does, rather. And these sort of extra features are what players latch onto and easy to sort of front load right away without necessarily being gated behind puzzle solving or story developments. You could log into, this is from Telling Lies, and you can log into this game and start playing it and just play solitaire. If you were feeling rebellious, as a player, you don't necessarily need to start watching videos, which is the major, obviously, narrative conceit of the game. You can just play solitaire. Although Sam and company did a clever thing, you can actually not finish this solitaire game. It is missing one card. So I think that's sort of
you can't win.
Yeah, you cannot win. So I think that's the subtle push to sort of say, please get on with the actual business of playing the game properly. I've often wondered if there's a narrative, a component to that missing card, but that's a conversation for another day, I think.
Yeah, and so just the takeaway here, I suppose, is that for every feature you add, there must be some kind of justification. Like I just said, these platforms have so much feature cruft that the developers are probably really irked by, and you don't want to take on this irkedness. So you have to ask yourself, like, will the user be overwhelmed with all of these things that we have to do? Will they be distracted by these period accurate mini games, avatars, bonsai buddies, etc. on the side? Do you have enough time to implement all of this? And just in general, does it serve the story, or is it just content that was on the original platform but you feel like you have to add because it was there? One thing that you can do is to simulate the presence of them, but not the functionality. And we mentioned Excalibur a couple slides back, and one thing it does do is it has, it's a Wikipedia-like, a fandom wiki-like, and it has wiki-accurate red links, so links to articles that don't exist. But if you click them, they don't do anything. They're just there for decoration, really. And it depends on the user how satisfying this is and how much, just the balance, again, between being accurate and just focusing people on what you want your story to do. But if you find yourself really struggling here, it might be a sign that the platform that you have in mind is just not a good fit for your story, because they should just work as seamlessly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so the next couple of slides. Yes, and so this is what I was talking about infinite content. Like, you really don't want to necessarily incorporate all of the garbage that has been posted over the weekend unless there is a story payoff for it. And so the other part of it, as you can see on the slide, is closely related to scope is pacing. So platforms are not linear. They don't have forward momentum. They're just perpetual floods of content. And they're by very much on purpose designed this way, especially if it's an online platform for ad revenue. But that doesn't really help you if you're trying to tell a story that makes sense. You need to impose some kind of constraints, and they're going to probably have to be something that you come up with that isn't immediately intuitive. And so again, there are a number of methods, and these methods aren't mutually exclusive. They will blend into each other, and a lot of games we talk about will fall into multiple categories. The first method, and probably the most visible one, is to provide some kind of frame story, some kind of narrative justification for you, the character, to be interacting with this interface in the first place. And any new content will be unlocked via this frame story rather than undirected discovery. So the screenshot we have here is from Hypnospace Outlaw. And in the story, you are, at least in the beginning, sort of an internet cop of sorts, although the title of that game might let on that the copness may or may not be the case for the entire thing. And you're tasked to sift through the hundreds of user-generated GeoCities-esque websites for content violations, which in this case is a copyright violation, which becomes a plot point later on. Mm-hmm. And you're identify these violations on the website, and once you find them, you report them back to your supervisor, who assigns you the next task. And you progress through the game that way. And the main issue here is that if you do want this kind of frame story, and you do want a fully diegetic game, how to keep it that way, because the temptation is to take it out of the platform. And there are obvious approaches here, like emails, README files on computers, about pages on websites, but most of these have been done before. You're looking at an email example right here. A lot of the standard narrative design platforms, a lot of the standard narrative design patterns, such as the three-choice structure, et cetera, may not obviously apply to this kind of thing because it's just more open-ended by design. So you need to do significant work to just gate your platform around your story and make it believable. And here, what is done is that Hypnospace Outlaw creates the illusion of quote-unquote levels. They cut off certain parts of their internet until you advance far enough. If you remember older GeoCities before, like Yahoo used their username with them, they would have portals like designed around interests, like music or the like, and that's the kind of thing they were emulating. And sometimes a frame story can reveal itself not immediately, but as you progress, as in her story, which is kind of one of the things that bleeds into our second category, which is something that dispenses with an outward facing frame story from the beginning, but silently unlock content as the player explores invisibly. You see here a screenshot of myself that I didn't add to the slide.
I'm guilty of this.
Yes, and it's an example of this, though, because the interface is similar to GitHub, and it's told through short linked vignettes that are presented as issue reports on the site. This is the first one, and once you see one that is linked to another story, only then will the companion issue show up. And CosmoServe and Digital mentioned before also work this way. You're browsing them, the news groups, et cetera, in real time. You actually can quote unquote post to them in real time, and new posts or emails will show up once you viewed a previous relevant event. And this is very compelling to a lot of people because it really does just emulate both exploring something in real time and doing it at one's own direction when done well. If done poorly, it can seem contrived, though. I mean, in the sense of, wow, the exact email that was relevant to what I just read just happened to show up 1 second after I read it. And it really requires careful writing to sustain the illusion of just participating and to just magician's choice the player behind the scenes so it works. Their self-discovery is as smooth as possible.
Yeah, and if you were to draw a sort of a Venn diagram with interface fiction on one side and epistolary interactive fiction on the other, I think those circles would overlap pretty strongly. But that said, epistolary interactive fiction, so if you're using emails and instant messages and stuff to tell your story, it takes a lot of care and thought to design well. You have to consider how to provide the player with the ability to make satisfying narrative choices, either mechanically, actually having an effect on the story, or even just a reflective choice. I think that First Draft of the Revolution, is probably the best example of how to do this well if you were interested in this sort of story. That's by Emily Short and Liza Daly. But I really want to, I'm going to toot Catherine's horn here, because Human Errors does a really interesting thing where you write your response to the person, in the sort of issue field, and you can type whatever you want, and it does show up. So you can be sort of reflective, and you can sort of say like, "Oh, I empathize with you," etc. And then as you click send, the message fades away. So it allows you the opportunity to sort of be reflective and to be thoughtful about a response to the user. But also it sort of makes clear that it won't necessarily respond as neatly as you might like. Digital does a similar thing where you just press reply to a message, and you are actually never given the option to enter anything of your own. You are left to interpret what you might have said in your message through the responses that you receive. And that's a really effective way to do this sort of thing as well.
Yeah, especially given this particular storyline, there are certain moments there which are directly responsible for my writing in the future. I was really inspired by that game. And the last note on this that we did want to add is that this isn't really the cleanest fit for every interface. It's not a coincidence that everything you've seen has been just websites, networks, things like that. If you're doing like an offline program, it's less immediately obvious how to make files spontaneously show up on your device or how to gate those. It can be done. We're kind of grappling with that problem ourselves in our shareware game, but it just doesn't immediately present itself like it would on a website. And so the final approach here, and by far the riskiest, is to do away with explicit constraints entirely. And depending on the game you're doing, you can think of this as analogous to sometimes sandbox games, sometimes, I don't use this as a pejorative, walking simulators, or ergodic text, which is a hypertext term for stories that the reader is piecing together from parts. And we see here Omnipedia, a neurocracy, which emulates Wikipedia, as you see here, Omnipedia. And the entire gameplay is going down these rabbit holes of revision history, of talk page arguments, so on and so forth, and the sordid future dystopian secrets that are being kind of talked around, like the world from which these things came. And then her story operates by asking players to search for keywords in a database to piece together video clips regarding an associated murder mystery, and the player needs to decide which keywords will be fruitful in terms of uncovering these clues. And it's not a coincidence that these games have a mystery element in common, because this approach lends itself well to games of exploration, of things that already happened and you're coming along later on as an explorer. The risks here, however, are fairly apparent, which is that the player is left to their own devices to pace the narrative. If they're not making some apparent progress, preferably from the start, they're likely to just bounce off it. And of course, the player has to be compelled enough by the interface to even want to explore it in the first place and care about what its internal logic might be. And careful writing, as always, is critical, especially writing that's conscious of your hints and your red herrings, and guiding the player through writing what might not be done explicitly with gating content. And indicators can also help in the interface. Her story provides a checklist for players to have confirmation that they are in fact making progress at all. And again, you have the immersiveness here, but it's by no means something that you can just throw a website together and expect that to be enough for the player to be like, I will explore this.
Yes, I have motivation.
Yeah.
It's tricky on that.
Yeah, so we got about 15 minutes left. So we've talked about storytelling through all of this, which is unsurprising since this is a narrative conference, but we would be remiss to not mention that if you're simulating a platform, you really want to simulate the platform, which means period appropriate art, sounds, and the like. Because as nostalgic as people tend to be for these, they also are very particular about their nostalgia. If something, as I mentioned, feels anachronistic, misremembered, or just off in any way, then they are going to notice. And they have very particular idiosyncratic individual points at which they might fall out of it. So there's no one thing that you can say don't do, except that given that trends recently like Vaporwave have retconned every piece of software between 1995 and 2010 into this like anachronistic pastel slurry, people are going to be primed for things seeming off.
Yeah, and memory is, obviously subjective, and so people are going to have different responses to different ways that you present your game and in different ways that you design your game. So that's also something to keep in mind. That are you going for pixel perfect accuracy, or are you sort of blending things together, and how do you do that in a way that doesn't necessarily disappoint the player's lofty expectations?
Yeah, and so if you're using existing platforms, you may not have much leeway here because not every platform allows you to be a MySpace teen and CSS your website up, which I love, just to be clear. But if you're simulating your own, then you do have quite a few options, surprisingly, perhaps.
Yeah.
A lot of the old tech that was used at the time is still available, and with some work can be retrofitted for modern platforms, although it does require some familiarity with that old technology in the first place and getting it to be compatible with future technology, which is sometimes non-trivial, to say the least. So if you don't want to do this non-trivial work, and depending on what it is, I may not blame you, there are many, many modern tools to emulate the same kind of thing, from the retro gaming community, the demo scene community, and a lot of others. And on this slide, we have a couple examples.
Yeah, we've so a confession to all of you. I was going through the work and going through the Everest Pipkin's Tiny Tools directory here, which I have a screenshot linked of, and it's going through things that might be relevant. But honestly, the interface fiction, you can do so much with it, and it's such a broad time period as well that I figured it would just be better to post the directory itself, because it's such a wonderful resource, and I find myself using this directory and the one below by Natalie Lawhead as well.
Yeah, I will put the link to that in the chat because I know it's a very long link.
So things to keep an eye out. There's Fantasy Console. We sort of mentioned that earlier. Things like retro textures and tiles, ASCII and text. I have been using the ASCII graphical editor Playski a lot for our shareware game. It's not only just a graphics editor, it's also a game creation tool. It's by JP LeBreton. Really highly recommend that. I've also been using a similar tool called RexPaint, which is an ASCII graphics editor. These two actually sort of work in slightly different ways. RexPaint is a lot more of an actual graphical editor. It does have like a layering functionality. So it functions sort of like Photoshop, but just with ASCII characters. This is by Grid Stage Games. So I sort of bounce back and forth between these two when I'm making fictional shareware things.
Yeah. And of course, for the more modern games, the tools are pretty much still available. These are obviously geared more toward retro games.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. These are ones that I have found personally useful in our shareware project.
Since ours is early 90s.
Yeah.
Or will be. Yeah. And so finally, as mentioned, we do have a list of other examples of games that use our various categories that we mentioned. And again, these are not exhaustive, and these also aren't meant to be like our top 10 or whatever. We really were going for just as broad as possible an overview of the kinds of things that can be done with this sort of game. So you have here simulated blogs, like browsers, websites, Windows interfaces, ROM pirating, virus scanners, poetry websites. And again, this is just a small sampling of what you can do. And some are more commercial, some are more experimental. And here are some examples of games within existing platforms. One thing I did want to highlight is that Lee Tussman's talk I thought was really amazing. And he had a lot of examples of various other file system games, which he had the link in his talk. I will post the link on here. We have one thing that I didn't mention, but I do have time to mention it, which is that I have really fond memories of this old writing website that was then called stories.com, now called writing.com, which did essentially choose your own adventure games, which were collaborative. So they
were rebranding to writing.com.
That was the whole thing, actually, yes. But they were collaborative in the sense that once you got to the end of the choose your own adventure story, you could write your own chapter. And they still are doing this. They still exist. I recommend it. And then the last one is kind of more for fun, but it's like an ongoing like ARG called The Backrooms, which is a lot of it is hosted on the wiki, and it's meant to simulate like this creepy alternate reality. And one major way to navigate it is to go on its wiki. So I say that counts. And then our final slide here is some examples of the partially diegetic interfaces, some of the major ones, and some we mentioned before, some are new. And as you can see on that final bullet point there, many, many more.
Yeah.
So many. If you know of ones we haven't mentioned, we would like to hear them.
I've seen some in the chat already, and
yes.
Very good suggestions as well. So that's it. That's all we've got. I am on Twitter at no noise, no bees. Why I chose that as a handle, I don't know. And Catherine is at Moriarty, and there is our itch pages if you wanted to check out some of our work as well.